Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the IISS Americas seminar on Russia, the West, and economic statecraft. Obviously, we are doing this within the fog of war, and it's a big challenge, but we have right now, 2 of our 3 expected speakers are on board. We are trying to get the 3rd one connected. I have with me this morning my 2 good friends of mine, both very expert in the field. Kupchan is the chairman of the Eurasia Group, a long-time Russia analyst, and has extensive experience in Moscow. He has been a participant at the Valdai workshops that have been hosted for nearly 20 years by President Putin, and has also worked at senior levels in the U.S. State Department, including on economic statecraft issues. He is joined by Dr. Nigel Gould-Davies, who is the senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia at IISS, as well as being the editor of our strategic survey, our annual overview of what's happening in the world. A former UK diplomat, Nigel also has extensive experience in Russia and in the area of the former Soviet Union. So hopefully we will be joined later by Elina Ribakova, who's the deputy chief economist at the International Institute of Finance, formerly at the IMF, but we are having trouble hooking her in. So let me start by introducing the themes of today's seminar, and that is economic statecraft in the relationship between Russia and the West. And there are 2 main themes that I want to look at here. So I don't want this discussion to become a general discussion on the state of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. That's very much in motion now. Russian troops are in Kyiv today, but rather I want to look at the issue of how the West and the United States, in particular, the Biden administration, has attempted to use financial and economic deterrence and punishment on the one hand, and Russia's use of energy, of their influence as an energy producer and supplier, particularly to Europe, on the other. So if I may, let me just start by asking each of you to comment first on the speech yesterday by President Biden announcing a new round of sanctions. Are these going to make a difference? Are they going to affect Russian behavior? And if so, how? And let me start first with you, Nigel, and then I will go on to Cliffy.
Yeah, one of the consequences of the buildup to this war and this flagrant intervention is invasion, I should say, is that the West and the United States in particular have had plenty of time in recent months to prepare a comprehensive sanctions package. Russia's use of force is different in this respect from the ways it has behaved in the past, when it's generally sought to intervene quickly and decisively and largely without warning, and forcing others to react and to respond to fait accompli on the ground. Here, we've all had 4 months of this build-up. So the United States has been in a good position to get everything ready to press the button on this. I don't think there's any great degree of confidence that the sanctions that had been signaled in preparation would serve as a deterrent. That's the first best solution, is that they deter Russia from carrying out military action. The question now is what is to be implemented and what its consequences will be. There are some very significant measures, of course. Is it quite at the top of the escalation ladder that was promised? I still think there's more that the United States and Western partners can do, but certainly this latest round, the inclusion of full blocking sanctions against the major banks, and beyond that to several sectors as well, that will cause pain and disconcertment. But it's important to understand the extent of the limits of what we can realistically hope to achieve. Russia is the biggest, most resilient, and with its sanctioners, most interdependent target of sanctions really in history. So we're in very, very different territory here from the smaller targets and adversaries we've seen in recent years, and against whom the contemporary sanctions instruments have been honed. So there can be no expectation that will bring the economy to its knees. The question then is by what mechanisms this pain will translate into change and reappraisal in due course. We can have a long conversation on that. I won't go into detail here, but I would say just in conclusion to this point, watch what the elites and the population alike in Russia do now in response to this war. This war is the least popular thing that Putin has ever done. And on day one, there are already significant signs of opposition to it among parts of the population, and otherwise very flattened and repressed civil society. But no less important, and I think more important, there are signs of deep anxiety among various sections of the Russian elite. And so if we're asking what the ultimate political impacts of sanctions can be, they can impose effects that will feed into and exacerbate the already deep and growing unease we see across Russia in response to this illegal and reckless invasion.
Thank you very much, Nigel. So let me welcome Elina. Thank you very, very much for joining us. I'm going to turn to Cliff next, but just to let you know, I've asked the first question on each of your assessments of the president's speech yesterday, in which he expanded U.S. sanctions, and whether or not and how this might affect Russian behavior and the flow of events in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So thank you, Nigel. Cliff.
Thank you, David, and thank you for inviting me. You know, in full disclosure, David's been one of my best friends for 30 years, so I'm not going to disagree with too much he says, at least publicly. So I'll make 4 points. The first one is Biden, I think, gets an A for what he's done here. And I say that as one who argues that Biden is not a successful president, that he's conducted an ineffective foreign policy. Afghanistan, Southeast Asia, Iran, I would argue that this has been a, if not incompetent, barely competent team. That said, I think that on this effort, Biden has been remarkably successful in getting European, Japanese, South Korean global buy-in to form a very impressive sanctions wall against the Russians. I'm surprised, actually. The Europeans are Exhibit A in this success. My jaw dropped when Scholz announced that Nord Stream was dead on day one. That was just a remarkable foreign policy victory for the Biden administration. Where the Europeans are on spare bank, I don't know yet, but that I'd love to know. They're with us on VTB and almost everything else, sanctioning Putin and Lavrov as we speak. Putin doesn't go to Florida on vacation a lot. I don't think he's got houses here, but still it's impressive symbolically. I think this is it's a biting package. Financial diplomacy has produced an array of measures that I think will probably take 2% of GDP. Elina can tell us what she thinks more accurately, but I think it's an impressive wall. It clearly isn't working and won't work. Biden doesn't care. Putin doesn't care. Just doesn't care. The Putin that I saw, talk about this more later on Monday, doesn't care. But finally, on financial diplomacy, I'd like to offer something a little, different and possibly goofy, but I actually think it's right. Well, in a political science framework, there's been some real pioneering work out there by, Kyle Oscaret and Michael Beckley has picked it up recently, which talks about orders of exclusion and how new orders are born out of crisis, or they're exclusionary. The Cold War was to exclude Russia. This order of exclusion that's forming among a potential alliance of democracies is being built to exclude both Russia and China. It's a real tricky order of exclusion that's being built, I think. But it's one that could well be forming. You do have an alliance of democracies here against Russia. Will it work? No. Is it really interesting in where it may be taking us? Post-Cold War, post two really aggressive autocracies. Yeah, I think it is, and I think it's really fascinating. And that's the main point that I would bring is an order of exclusion against Russia and China that is developing currently out of left field or right field or out of no field, but with really unexpected force. I find it, as a political scientist, really fascinating. So thank you, David.
Great. Thank you very much, Cliff. And we will return to this question of an order of exclusion. I think it's a really important one. But let's stay on the crisis here for now. Elina, welcome, and your comments about the president's speech yesterday. Will it have an impact? And your views about sanctions in this case, and where we're heading, and what the responses might be.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here. And I think also I look forward to the discussion because it has moved squarely into the geopolitical sphere, national security sphere. It's almost beginning, I can feel it sort of slipping away from my hands as an economist. I understand that economic sanctions are part of the economic statecraft, and economic statecraft is an important part of the toolbox of broader foreign policy. But we're, of course, at the stage of war at the moment as well. So what I wanted to highlight from Biden's speech is that it's indeed multilateral. I'm not surprised by that, because I think with the new administration, there's been a very strong feel of reapproaching with European partners and also making sanctions multilateral. And also we have seen a very strong team of sanctions experts in different parts of this administration going back into the administration and working on this. And as you know, they started with the sanctions review, which they published a very small 2-page summary, but they did a lot of soul searching internally, what kind of escalation ladder they want to have, what kind of unintended consequences it might have, what kind of unintended consequences on the global markets, on the global markets, financial sector, plumbing, and energy markets as well. So they prepared from the technical side very well, and they've also coordinated with European partners. I know we're talking about Russia, Ukraine, but also let's not forget that European partners recently putting legislation to parliament how to strengthen a European economic sort of national security was the new tool that they're proposing. They've been thinking a lot about it. And one of the reasons they started thinking about it more was Russia, China, but also US during the previous administration. That's where the national economic sovereignty was back on the agenda. We also saw a EU Commission being geopolitical. ECB is promoting euro. So that is, let's just sort of keep that in mind. So I think for the US, the transatlantic partner, to come back to multilateral conversation is extremely important. So that's on the international relations and Biden speech. In terms of the biting of sanctions or not, I have a sense that Russian authorities have worked through the options. We all know these options. It's not a rocket science or extremely I didn't mean to say that. It's not that it's hidden, right? We all know what it can be. It can be the measures that we have seen for the financial system. It can be measures on SWIFT. It can be measures on the central bank. It can be measures on energy. So by stepping forward with the war in Ukraine, I get a sense that the authorities are ready, in a sense, ready to take the pain and ready to deal with it. And just sort of entertaining fact, I think yesterday, the night before, Sberbank published a statement saying that they're already under sanctions. This was a full day before the announcement from the White House. They made a statement. They said, this is the measures we're taking. Well, they took it down quickly when they realized actually US is not reacting that fast. So that means that they're prepared, and BTB shares are sort of even performing today. So it seems that it's no longer such an important part of the thinking that goes into the military strategy. And after the sort of the sanctions that were announced from global leaders, which is fantastic, but you saw that Kyiv has been shelled aggressively overnight, which sort of a response that, yes, it's all great, but we will keep on stepping up the ante, and we're not being deterred by what's happening now.
Thank you very, very much. I'd like to get to the other side of this, and that is the leverage that Russia gains or has as an energy producer. And if I could start this time with Cliff, then I'll go to Elina and then to Nigel. How much leverage does Russia take here as a major energy producer, and how have they tried to maximize their benefits from that?
Russia has a lot of leverage, especially in the gas sector relative to Europe. We know the numbers, 40% of imports or something. It varies somewhat by country. Germany is very dependent. Other countries, dependent, but less so. To me, I'm not a big supporter of how much leverage they ultimately have or have used. I don't think that Putin has used, except in the former Soviet Union. Yeah, I mean, turned the lights out, Armenia, Belarus. He turned the lights out a few times and the heat off. Otherwise, I think Gazprom has been, and Russian oil companies, very cognizant that it's a one card, one time, at enormous cost kind of deal. And I think over time, Russia has been a pretty reliable supplier. Even recently, I'm not convinced that Putin's played the energy card. I think that supply they need it for the domestic market when there are alternative explanations anyway in this crisis as to whether Putin has used the card or not. To me, moving forward, the track record being ambiguous, the issue then to me devolves to what are the real issues moving forward on Russia's leverage with energy. And I think it mostly flows from the dynamics surrounding Putin's speech on Monday, that hour-long rant. There was essentially a declaration of war. And to me was, having seen him 15 plus times in different environments, some of them small, some of them larger, this was a different Putin to me. It was a Putin who I always described him as an opportunistic pragmatist, one who liked to pounce, but ultimately was very aware of cost benefit. I mean, look at his macroeconomic policy over the years. The leading member of the Chicago School of Economics residing in Moscow. Hardly risky, very conservative to me. But, Elina will probably jump on me for saying that, but that's what I think. The guy on Monday was not as put together, was angry, was bitter, was emotional. And then we have to look fast forward, this guy being in charge of oil and gas. If I were Germany and dependent on, maybe he'll get a good night's sleep and after the war become Putin 1.0, but now he's Putin 2.0. And I think that guy is much more likely to screw around with this stuff than he has in the past. So that's where I come out, Gordo.
Thank you very much. Elina.
I think I absolutely agree with Cliff, and I'm very glad we're here. We used to meet in Moscow some time ago. As you noticed, probably, and Nigel and David, you and many of our listeners, almost entire Russian analyst community, by presuming some sort of rationality, refused to believe in the war. And I don't want to apologize. I think nobody wants to apologize. I mean, people apologize for that, but I think that what failed us here is exactly the same thinking of pragmatism, opportunistic pragmatism, as Cliff said, that he will press we saw the conflict coming. That was clear, because the fallout between Zelensky and Putin was long coming. It was spent more than a year and a half before today with the sort of difficulty in fulfilling Minsk agreement. That's why I see it, that Putin sort of pushed the Minsk agreements. Two parties were supposed to be blamed for that. One is Ukraine and one is Russia. Russia was the porous border, and Ukraine was not fulfilling the autonomy of these regions, right? And I think with Zelensky understanding that it's a political suicide and bulking at that, then Putin said, well, I'm going to show you, right? But nobody believed how far we're going to get into this. The authorities are very prepared, and the sanctions so far not biting enough, I think, for them to make the change. And I think that is a critical point. It is fantastic what has been done from the US side, but from the Russian authorities side, I think it's just not strong enough. That is what is my take. And I don't think it's going to change the rationale at the moment.
Thank you. So before I turn to Nigel, just let me say that Nigel and I had lunch back in November, and Nigel told me that he expected a full-scale invasion of Ukraine to be Putin's endgame here. So I think that definitely, Elina, both you and Cliff are right, saying that most people, most of the analytic community was on the pragmatism in the end dominating, but Nigel was on this from early on. So what's your sense, Nigel, is Putin optimistic about the energy dimension of this giving him particular leverage is the point I would ask you about.
Well, thank you, David. I would have been very, very happy to have been wrong, of course, on that prediction. So I'm just pick up a couple of points here. Firstly, I do think there's clear signs that Russia, in ways that it hasn't done until now, has been sending signals of pressure on the EU with regard to energy dependence. I think when the International Energy Agency, a normally very careful non-political body, comes out and says explicitly that that Russia is using its decisions not to renew gas storage in Europe as a political weapon, I think we need to take that very seriously. And it's not necessarily a matter of turning a switch on or off. You can play with flows in ways that are less flagrant, but where the signal is hardly less clear than that. And that is what Russia has been doing already. It's been doing that more explicitly with Moldova ever since Moldova renewed its aspirations to join the EU. So I think anyone looking at Russia's treatment of Europe in respect of gas comes away with some unmistakable conclusions over the past few months. On the matter of whether and how much it might go further, which is to say how far Russia might more severely interfere with its supply to Europe, I think there are two questions here. The first is how vulnerable Europe is, and the second is how credible the threat that Russia might play these sorts of games. Europe's vulnerability, of course, is not only a matter of numbers, it's not only a matter of flows and percentages of supply, it's a matter of alternatives and its own domestic connectivity. And the EU has taken significant steps in recent years to protect itself against the contingency of a catastrophic disruption from any source, but including Russia turning off the taps. And in every sense, of course, global gas markets have become more liquid. The capacity to import LNG and then send it around the continent is now greatly enhanced. There's gas storage not controlled by Gazprom in Europe, which also has a protective effect. And the best assessment suggests that at least for the first year, even if a total cut in supply, prices would of course rise, but the pain would be one of price rather than one of access. So it's not a matter of the lights and heating being turned off, it's a matter of these things being more expensive. But when you're dealing with a major adversary, there's no costless response. This is a larger point to make about sanctions themselves. Yes, they may have adverse economic consequences for the senders of sanctions, Western countries. But again, what's the opportunity cost? What's the least bad alternative? What's the least costly course of action when you're dealing with a major military threat on your continent? Of course, there's any way of dealing with that will bear costs. Better economic costs, better higher inflation, the military costs, the military threat and military pressure. The second point is how credible the threat would be. And then we begin to move into these darker, murkier matters of Putin's psychology and his thinking. I personally would not have described Putin as a pragmatist for some years now. I think there's been a direction of travel to his actions and to the thinking that underlies it. But even putting that aside, we've seen a clear and significant step change over the past year or so. And if it's been a matter of Putin taking controlled and calculated risks up to now, we find ourselves in the territory of him taking incalculable risks, as it were, gambling, not merely risking, and unleashing forces that may have consequences for Russia itself domestically that he may not fully appreciate. And that's the larger point here. It's not really whether Putin cares about sanctions or not. His views are less important than the consequences both of all of the costs of war in terms of blood and treasure and how they shape elite opinion and how they shape domestic opinion. It is the circumstances in which Putin is making policy and the political forces that form around and possibly against him, especially as we approach the pseudo-election of 2024. Those are the things to be concerned about. But back to the central question of Putin's possible use of energy, I absolutely believe that we have to worry now. We need a new degree of strategic imagination. We have to imagine the things we'd much rather not think about that Putin could possibly contemplate. The looseness of his talk about nuclear weapons in recent years has already been disconcerting. The fact that he made a barely veiled threat to retaliate with nuclear weapons against anyone who hinders his goals in Ukraine makes that much more pointed. The possibility that his ambitions might not be limited to the reclaiming of what he sees as historic Russian lands in Ukraine, but might go further to, as he would see it, reversing or disemboweling the consequences of NATO enlargement, and might go further by provoking an Article 5 crisis by infringing on a smaller NATO member state. These are the sorts of possibilities we really have to take seriously, however unpalatable. And in that universe of possibilities, indeed, there is the possible use of the energy weapon on a severe scale. The fact that he hasn't done that in the past is no guide to his future behavior.
Thank you very, very much. So in the aftermath of the president's speech yesterday, there was a lot of commentary on what wasn't mentioned, and in particular on the possibility of withdrawing Russian ability to utilize the SWIFT payment system. Are we heading towards a situation in which Russia gets excluded from SWIFT? Does that make strategic sense? What is the view of U.S. allies in Europe on that?
So I can,
Elina, yes.
I'm happy to start on that one. I think SWIFT, just a quick reminder, it's a global cooperative for financial institutions. We have about 11,000 different ones in there, about 200 different countries covered. And some countries also use it for domestic payments messaging system. It's not a settlement system. It's just a sort of information exchange, right, so that we know what kind of flows are happening. So Russia has about 700 billion of exports and imports flows with different countries. China is a very important country where they import from. And Europe, as we already discussed, is a very important buyer of energy. And then for that, we need to have transactions recorded. The issue with sanctioning SWIFT with carve-outs for energy, I think it all brings us back to energy in a way. It's not the same as anything, right? I mean, the issue, we have an example of Iran being disconnected from SWIFT in 2012, and then in 2018 unilaterally by the US. The issue there was that everything was excluded, that's, and even if Iran for certain, there was some sort of the periods and certain exceptions, but even if they could get some money from the oil exports, they could not spend it on anything, right? So, so I think it very much depends on which banks are targeted for SWIFT and also which elements are carved out. And for our Russia, it is an important thing is still, it's still energy. And let us not forget, so that is on the external front. On the domestic front, about 20% of transactions are used via the domestic payments messaging system. So Russia is already doing that. It's not the case, was not the case in 2014. If you would have disconnected Russia in 2014, and you remember there was talk of that already, Russian domestic payments transactions would be almost impossible to settle, or rather to get information on. And now they have the domestic system. A lot of wages, pensions, everything is settled through that system. It's about 20%. Of course, there is an operational risk of going from 20 to 100 over a course of few days, but it's technically possible people will be able to do that, especially that 70% of Russian transactions are non-cash. They went through massive the sort of digitalization, and those of you, Nigel and you and Cliff, that traveled to Russia for many years, it's almost incredible to believe, right? And of course, the Russian central bank is also developing digital ruble, and they started piloting it today this month. Here I have a question. If we were to disconnect Russia from SWIFT properly, what happens with the link with the Chinese national payments settlement system and also messaging system? There isn't a link now. We heard the news from 2019-18 that there might be a link. There haven't been any real transactions. One of the Chinese banks is part of the Russian system, and Russia Russian banks, I think there are sort of in low teens banks are part of the Chinese system. So here, and we also had a question here on the chat, I think the China's stance in energy and in payments, I think will be critical as well.
Cliff, you follow these issues in real time for financial clients. I know. What's your thinking on SWIFT and where we might be heading?
Well, SWIFT's not happening. I know it's a measure of last resort for the Biden administration. They really don't want to do it, mostly because the Europeans really don't want to do it. Iran is a much smaller economy. You can take them out of SWIFT. No big deal. Given the size of transactions that go in and out of a major economy, it doesn't seem to be really doable, which gets to the broader point, I think. I'm not a SWIFT expert, so I'm not going to, I take notes when Elina talks, but I don't make up stuff here. What in God's name do we do with Russia now? SWIFT won't work. These sanctions just won't work. Is the best we can do to build up NATO and build a wall around it? I mean, sort of containment? What do we do in cyberspace? What do we do in space? What levers do we have that will have impact? Do we have any? And if we don't, what do we do? So I raised the questions. I don't have answers yet. This war is like 3 days old, but I think that there's a big challenge for the Western academic community to start to provide answers here. So I guess that'll be my comment.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn to our questions from the floor.
Sorry, David, can I just...
Oh, I'm sorry,
to interrupt.
Nigel. Absolutely.
Something about SWIFT and all its works, yeah.
Oh, please.
So SWIFT is ultimately less significant and has less of an impact than the full blocking sanctions on financial and other institutions. So, I mean, there is a tendency to sort of fixate on it as a kind of nuclear weapon, and if it's not being used, then sanctions aren't as significant as they should be. Yes, it would make a difference, but really, in terms of their actual restrictive effect, the blocking sanctions are very, very potent in their own terms. Just a broader remark about sanctions, I would not share the view that we can simply assume that sanctions won't work. And if we sort of explore that issue, we need to understand, or at least share a view about what it means for sanctions to work or not work. They're not a light switch or a button you press and then suddenly things happen. In international politics, especially when you're dealing with large and powerful adversaries, there's no instrument that has earlier immediate effects like that. So the point is to think through the ways and the timescales on which things do have effects. And yes, of course, Russia has worked hard to prepare for the consequences of sanctions, but does that mean it is prepared? I'm not at all sure of that. Sanctions are deeply unwelcome. And the fact that in the past year, Russia has been issuing such serious threats to the European Union and then actually to the United States of retaliation against sanctions shows how undesirable they are. They're not an immediate or magic bullet. They have effects that work through the system. I would add that there is very good evidence that they had a deterrent effect. Back in 2014 and early 2015, at the height of some of the fighting then, there is quite specific evidence that the privately communicated threat of a dramatic escalation of sanctions helped stay Russia's hand there. And we're looking at more severe sanctions applied, as others have noted, more multilaterally now, and that's very welcome. Again, it's not a matter of whether Putin cares. It's not even say, oh, gee, we've got these sanctions coming up, I'm going to withdraw. That's a caricature. It's a matter of the effect they have on the perceptions and moods within the country around Putin. And I repeat, both among the large majority of the population and among elites themselves.
Great. Thank you very much. Let me look at some of the questions from the floor. The first one I'd like each of you to comment on is is Moscow's increasing dependence on Beijing going to be a useful element for Putin and Russia in the longer term, or does it carry its own risks?
Maybe I could start just
Elina,
quickly
please.
sort of commenting. I think it is critical. China has been very neutral in the last couple of days. Very, very careful with the comments,
Yes.
almost none. And they are also a little bit between the rock and the hard place. Russian relationship, if you look at the historical reasons for Russia and China to cooperate, there have been plenty. But up until the recent sanctions episodes, we had much smaller level of cooperation than it should have been. Even if you use a simple gravity model for FDI or trade, you would always like to have it with this huge residual, which means there is a historical reason why that's not happening. Russia always felt that it's a junior partner in the relationship with China and has been always very wary of that being taken over by China, especially in the 2008 when they tried to do some of the Gazprom deals. They always felt that they sort of get the short, the worst part of the deal in that relationship. And the fact that this sort of linking up of the payment systems and the supposed cooperation, there was even announcements on both the Chinese and Russian side, and nothing sort of went forward because they couldn't agree on which exact system they're going to use. It's telling to me that even in the spirit of sanctions, the relationship is not very smooth. So now going forward, I think it's important which stance China takes, because it could be a situation where it can continue buying energy. Russia might be more interested diverting more energy towards China. It might be sort of holding Russia hostage in terms of the payment system. But on the other hand, it's also risking partially sanctions or secondary sanctions from the US. Also, the export controls part, if the US keeps on going more with export controls, also China is an important player there. They might not have the latest technology, but they might have sort of the less recent technology, and they could help Russia on that front. China also is engaged in Ukraine. There are also some of the industrial Ukrainian complex that is active export to China, including some of it in the military complex. So it might not be too healthy, and I think they commented about the sort of integrity of Ukraine as well.
Cliff.
I think Xi Jinping is mortified at what Putin's doing. It's kind of like a situation where a relative gets drunk at a party. Still a relative, but what the hell do you do to him? Let's see what these Chinese-driven talks do that are in the press today. I don't know enough about them to really comment with any confidence, but the China-Russia thing is very complicated. Yeah, I agree that they are closer than they've ever been. Over what? That's kind of over a low bar in reality. These two don't trust each other. I think this is a whoopee cushion for the press. They can write and write and write, and everybody's going to read it. But in my experience with Russian elites, and recently a lot more with Chinese elites, it's a very complicated relationship. So I would stop it there.
Right. Question for you all. So do you think that this crisis is going to lead to a permanent mothballing of Nord Stream 2? And if not, is Europe and particularly Germany positioning itself to just be constantly put in untenable positions by Russian behavior? So two-sided question. Nigel?
Yeah, David, I'll just add a couple of remarks on the China issue first. So,
please.
I think as Cliff said, complexity is a much better description than strength if we're looking at trying to characterize the Sino-Russian relationship. And economically in particular, I do think there's less than meets the eye here. The test of that, people look at sort of trade volumes and that sort of thing. Test of this is foreign direct investment. And China invests almost nothing in the Russian economy. Still today, less than several individual Western countries. There's a great deal of distrust, misunderstanding, and on the Chinese side in particular, very hard bargaining. The idea that China can somehow help Russia out in any substantial way from effects of sanctions is a fantasy, frankly, amplified by the news that's just coming in today that Chinese banks have begun to restrict the financing of Russian commodities. They have been deterred and will continue to be deterred by the effects of Western, particularly American sanctions. That's a potent global weapon. I fully agree with Cliff that that China is probably appalled and embarrassed and anxious by Russia's reckless sowing of instability in Europe. I mean, for all of the difficulties of the Sino-European relationship in the last couple of years in particular, this is a fundamentally important trade and investment partner for China. And China will not want anything that disrupts or threatens to undermine that. And finally, just going back to the surreal improv theater of the absurd, as we have to call it, of the Security Council meeting, the unprecedented televised Security Council meeting that Russia broadcast on Monday.
The Russian Security Council, not the UN Security Council.
The Russian Security Council, yes. And here's Putin in imperious isolation, berating and humiliating those closest to him. You know, for whose benefit? I'm not sure anyone, but you know, to this point, China, when she would have regarded that spectacle with any degree of respect. On Nord Stream 2, I can't see how it's not dead forever now, given what's happened. And of course, it's been an issue of contestation within the German coalition government, but they've come out and more forthrightly than I think some feared, have now said this social democratic chancellor has said, no, it's not going to be, the certification process is not going to proceed. So the symbolic weight of this issue is now so significant that it's impossible, at least for me, to imagine that this might be put back on anyone's table at all.
So that's my view. Just let me ask Elina and Cliff if they agree with that this is probably the death knell of Nord Stream 2.
I think it's dead and it's insignificant. And it has been insignificant for years. Okay. Russia supplies Europe as is. Russia is also a player on LNG. We don't have to get into details of gas pipes and sort of maintenance of them and different weather conditions. That it would be nice to have extra capacity. It would be nice to kick out Ukraine out of the sort of supply, but we're way beyond that. So Nord Stream being out is neither here nor there. And in terms of the sunk cost for Russia, Russian Winter Olympics were $50 billion. That was most of it was fraud, right? So I think given on the scale of fraud at Gazprom, it's not even a big issue. So that's my 2 cents.
So I have a question here that gets a little bit to Cliff's point at the beginning. And are we going to see as a result of this, Iran, China, and Russia coming together even more than they have done in the past? Cliff, this would be your sort of the other side of your order of exclusion, the alliance of the excluded.
Well, I guess kind of. I mean, you know, what's interesting about orders of exclusion is that they create orders that are functional and provide benefits and public goods to the members, like the EU and NATO during the Cold War. But deductively anyway, they don't necessarily provide those public goods to those on the outside. it's an order, and then it's either in or you're out. So I wouldn't say deductively the others gain very much unless they take action. And bringing those three together would be a hell of a tough thing to do. I mean, the Iranians are, they're similar in many ways, which don't benefit any of the members. The Iranians have the same sort of cultural phobias and dislikes and distrusts. I mean, to cut to the chase, they don't trust each other. So no would be my answer.
Yep. Elina.
I'm very much concur with Cliff on this one. I think China, Russia already discussed. In terms of Iran, they've been warming up together, but it's not clear what Russia gains from that relationship. It's almost Iran reached out to Russia once they realized that they're in the same pariah group rather than the other way around. So I don't see that much risk of that. I think there was maybe 5 years down the road without the war in Ukraine, there was a risk of potentially Russia moving towards CBDCs, China moving towards CBDCs, maybe even negotiating with European partners, and this way sort of creating a bloc where, you know, there is a little bit more exclusion of the US, especially the US, of course, is a bit slow on that development. But I think with the war in Ukraine, we're on a completely different trajectory.
Nigel?
Yeah. Fully agree with Cliff and Elina. Again, I've always seen less than meets the eye to the Sino-Russian relationship. It is the best it's ever been, but as Cliff said, that's a relatively low bar. If we're to distill the essence of what the glue that holds this together, I would say it's more than anything a defensive ideological alliance, and ideological in the sense of being anti-democratic. These are regimes which feel threatened by and seek to resist the influence of rule-based democratic systems. That's more urgent for Russia because Russia's regime feels more embattled. Putin feels more insecure, which is precisely why he's tightening his repression literally every month. If it's a matter of cooperation to project power together, no, I do not see it as that kind of alliance at all. And that's why the most significant cooperation they engage in is in matters of domestic surveillance, the sharing of methods and technologies to control their own populations. It's not widely noted, but there's a great deal of that sort of thing going on. And all this is true even before the present crisis. And as Cliff and Elina have both said, I think this makes it harder now to imagine that that China would want to hitch itself to this dangerous and unpredictably careening Putin's Russia.
So let me ask each of you, we're getting near the end of our time. So my final question is, as a result of this crisis and the responses made by the US, by Russia, by China, by Europe, is economic statecraft going to become a more significant element of national power, or might it become a less significant element of national power in the eyes of the major actors in the international system?
I think it's absolutely becoming more significant because we saw very clearly from President Biden that there will not be troops in Ukraine. So he was very clearly explaining that. And also Russia is a nuclear power. So trying to move to other means of coercion is nearly impossible, right? So I think the statecraft will have to be more nuanced, more focused on limiting unintended consequences. And Nigel said it very correctly. It's very hard to impose sanctions without actually realizing some cost on yourself. And I think people in the authorities now realize that. And it's also important to impose sanctions while at the same time keeping in touch and sort of winning the hearts and minds of Russian population as well. And then my only sort of closing remark, what I'm particularly worried about, given how unhinged the situation is, and we described President Putin, is that whether we'll end up a Syria-like situation in Ukraine for much longer than we're all currently expecting.
Great. Thank you, Elena. Nigel, and then Cliff will have the last word.
I think unquestioningly we will see more economic statecraft, not less. What we have right now, as I mentioned earlier, is the imposition of the most significant economic and financial sanctions against the biggest target in history. And so it's a great test, if you like, a contest between two different forms of power, a local military superiority and a global financial and economic superiority. That in its own terms is significant for the rivalry with Russia, but I suspect that's just a foretaste of what might come as we all seek to understand and manage the rise of China, which is for many reasons, a much more complicated geo-economic puzzle. But weapons and instruments are being honed now, which have applications into the future against more tenacious rivals. So the lessons of what we are seeing unfold now will have larger significance, and everyone, including China, will be watching closely what happens.
Cliff, last word.
Things are complicated situation. In the short term, I think economic diplomacy will become much less relevant. We have a military power kicking around. NATO is going to have to be bolstered. The money's got to come from somewhere. I think if Putin has brought the defense world back upon us, kind of a back to the future. The problem is that Russia's a dying power. You know, we have to, if you look longer term, future, time is not on Putin's side. It's just not a structural force. I think in the next 5 years, economic diplomacy has been really hit. In the longer term, this is about an economic competition between the US and China, as Nigel said.
Yeah.
So I think we're seeing kind of a historical aberration here, if you want to look at the correlation of forces. And this will become a blip in a longer term procedure where economic statecraft is more and more important. So I'll close with that.
Great. I want to thank each of our three presenters for a really robust discussion. I know it's very, very hard. We're in the fog of war here, and talking about economic statecraft in the fog of war is not an easy thing to do. I appreciate all of your time and energy and effort, and thanks to all our participants on the line. And I will bring today's IISS America's seminar to a close. Thank you, Elina, Nigel, and Cliff. Good day, everybody.